welcome to a conversation with Nicholas Kristof. We are really excited to have you here for this conversation. I'm Regina Lawrence. I'm the Associate Dean for the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon here in Portland. And I want to start by giving a really hearty thanks to our partners and sponsors in this event, our wonderful local online news association partners, and also the Portland chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, who have just both been wonderful to work with. And we are especially excited at the SOJC because here in Portland, we have a multimedia journalism program, and we concentrate a lot on telling the stories of communities and telling stories with an eye toward both illumination and social change. And so to be able to be in this conversation with Mr. Kristof about his work is really a wonderful opportunity. I do want to say just a quick word about the format for the evening. If you all could please be sure and remain muted, we'd appreciate it. Please use the chat, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, to enter any questions that you may have. We will go to a Q&A session roughly about halfway into the evening. So we'd love to hear from you on your questions, and I'll be moderating those questions for you. And so with that, I'd love to introduce our conversation narrator this evening, George Rede. George is a veteran Oregon journalist and a recently retired adjunct instructor in the Department of Communication at Portland State University. During his 30-year career at the Oregonian, George worked as a reporter, editor, editorial writer, newsroom recruiter. He left the newsroom in 2015, and he transitioned to college teaching the following year, specializing in media literacy and media ethics at Portland State and at Washington State University in Vancouver. George has been a frequent guest on Think Out Loud, offering commentary and analysis on OPB's weekly public affairs program. And working with Portland State's Education Abroad program, he taught a summer course in London in 2018 and 2019, and hopes to do so again in Berlin in 2021. So George, thank you very much, and the stage is yours.
Very much, Regina, for that kind introduction. I want to add my thanks to all of our sponsoring organizations and to our guest speaker for making time for this important discussion, which comes just 1 month away from Election Day. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, both journalists and non-journalists alike. Why don't we just get going right away to make the most of this hour? I think that most of us are familiar with Nicholas Kristof's impressive background, long list of accomplishments, too numerous to list here, but he is an op-ed columnist at the New York Times, a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for both international reporting and for commentary, and the author of 5 books co-written with his wife, Sheryl WuDunn. Nick grew up on the family farm in Yamhill, and maybe he'll say something about his background. It's his turn to talk. About 40 minutes southwest of Portland, and he attended Yamhill Carleton High School. There, he was student body president, he ran cross country, and among other activities, participated in the FFA, Future Farmers of America. He graduated from Harvard, studied law at Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. His journalism career began in high school and included reporting internships at the Oregonian and at the Washington Post. He joined the New York Times in 1984, initially covering economics. He later became an international correspondent and became a columnist in 2001. His newest book, co-authored with his wife, is Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. So that's the focus of our discussion tonight. I will tell you that much of the book focuses on Nick's neighbors who grew up riding with him on the number 6 school bus to the Yamhill grade school. 2 families in particular are featured in the book, the Knapps and the Greens. Each of those families tragically lost 4 of their 5 children to so-called deaths of despair deaths resulting from suicide, depression, drugs, alcohol, obesity, and other health issues. According to researchers, these deaths are frequently tied to a loss of jobs and self-esteem and to diminished opportunities for their children. These deaths are concentrated among white working class men, and perhaps because they do represent that demographic, they've garnered more attention nationally than other groups. Overall, the book documents the struggles of the working class through reams of data, lots of anecdotes around the country, and portraits of men and women in Yamhill. The book traces what's happened in the past 40 to 50 years in US public policy, as well as to the national economy. It also examines our attitudes toward the poor and gives a voice to those millions of forgotten Americans. It's an illuminating book with a stirring call to action. And I'm very glad that Nick has agreed to answer a few questions from me before we open up things to all of you. So again, Nick, thanks for making time. And let me start out with the first very obvious question. What was your purpose, your goal in writing this book? And what did you hope people would take away from it?
Sure. Well, George, thank you. Thanks for the great introduction. Nice to see everybody there on my screen. I'm kind of calculating. I'm in Yamhill right now on the family farm, and I'm trying to calculate whether it's going to get dark before the program ends. But at least for now, I'll be outside here, and I can briefly show you a little bit of what the farm looks like. You can sort of kind of see some of it out there. And kind of in the distance, maybe you can see some, maybe not, some apples. Anyway, way over there, you have to take my word for it. There are some cider apples. And actually my standing desk is a cider apple crate. And so let me try to balance my laptop on my standing desk here. So, you know, we wrote Tightrope. Essentially, I was running around the world covering humanitarian crises in Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen, in Myanmar, and I gradually realized there was a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Yamhill. And a quarter of the kids on the number 6 school bus with me have died of drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And, you know, one thing that was particularly hard to come to grips with was that, well, I've written a lot about sexual violence and understand the trauma that it produces. You know, there are 2 boys that were with me on the number 6 school bus, one in particular, a close friend of mine, who were both imprisoned for raping young girls, very young girls. And I was trying to understand how that happened, how it was that so many people died and that so many people, you know, engaged in just outrageous, horrifying behavior like that. And I wondered for a while if it was something about Yamhill or the number 6 bus or the water, or, you know, but of course it wasn't. And there were similar crises happening in working class communities around the country. And when I saw that life expectancy for the United States was dropping, ultimately for 3 years in a row, even before COVID, for the first time in 100 years, it kind of hit me, you know, how much of a national crisis this was. And I think I was also struck that I spent a lot of time covering Afghanistan and Iraq, and those were important stories that, you know, I thought they deserved a lot of coverage. But at the end of the day, every 2 weeks, we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, these deaths of despair, than we lost in 19 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it didn't seem to me that this tragedy at home was getting the attention it deserved, either the deaths or just the degree of dysfunction and the toll on children. 1 child in 7 in the US right now is growing up with a parent with a dependency challenge. And, you know, I think we've, as a country, particularly mangled drug policy. And so we wanted to call attention to these issues, to highlight policies that we would think would work, and maybe also address this narrative of personal responsibility, which we think is one of the reasons that policy has been so bad.
Great, thanks very much. Second question has to do with I guess the mechanics of the book. How did you go about the work? How long did it take you from start to finish? And can you talk about how your wife and you collaborate? How do you determine who does what in terms of reporting, research, writing, editing? And since there are many journalists here, are there any tips in particular you'd offer for fellow journalists thinking of collaborating?
George, when people ask that question, usually the subtext is, how do you write books together and stay married? And the truth is that if you can raise kids together and stay married, a book is a piece of cake. A book doesn't play you off each other. You can put a manuscript down at night and it stays down. And in many ways, Sheryl and I, we started off our married life as foreign correspondents together. And it was a time in China when we were tailed relentlessly, when the government was really trying to find out who our sources were. So we felt under enormous pressure, and it just was so reassuring to be able to confide in a soulmate and to share secrets with somebody and debate really thorny ethical issues with your spouse. And in the case of the books, we never really wrote articles together for the New York Times, but with the books, it was always just kind of accepted that we would report and write the books together. And we typically approach different issues. So I will go and talk to one family and get their history and then write it up. And then Sheryl will go off and talk to other people and write that up. And then we edit each other quite heavily. Our feelings tend not to be too bruised by that process, partly because, we're accustomed to being edited. If people are not accustomed to being edited, maybe, be a little cautious about your suggestions. And then we, because we edit each other so heavily, I don't think it's all that obvious to a reader at the end of the day who was written which part. In this case, it made sense for me to do most of the Yamhill parts because these were people that I had known, since we were all children, writing notes to each other in class. And and we wanted it to be more than a book about Yamhill. We also wanted it to cover something of the African-American experience, the Latino experience, the urban experience. And so Sheryl, went to Alabama to talk to a Black woman who was sentenced to prison for 999 years on a nonviolent drug offense. I spent more of the time on Yamhill.
Okay, great. Next question. The book was published in January. So in the several months since that time, what has reaction to the book been like, both from those whom you wrote about, as well as perhaps those with influence as policymakers? And on the whole, have you been encouraged or discouraged by feedback?
First among, the influencers, the reviews, and so on, I think that all was very positive. I do think that in general, one of the problems with books is that people who start out interested in a subject tend to be those who read about a topic. And so you tend to preach to the choir. Partly for that reason, we also did a PBS documentary that will air, I think it's October 25th. And, a documentary is a way of reaching people by accident who don't necessarily care about a topic. I think also in this case, we probably reached a I mean, my sense is that we reached a lot of working class folks for whom the book kind of felt like it was talking about them and their lives and their communities. And to the extent that white working class communities tend to be more conservative, there we probably did reach beyond the choir. And we were nervous about how Yamhill would feel about the book. You know, we air a lot of dirty laundry, and it's now people often associate Yamhill with great wine tastings, and we do produce some extraordinarily good wines, but you know, we're also pretty good at cooking meth, and that's what my school bus graduates were about. And in general, the people who benefited from the wine industry have been outsiders who have moved in more than the traditionally local community. And also, you know, the people in the book, we did not show what we'd written to them before it came out. And my solutions to the problems tended to be pretty liberal, progressive solutions, while they tended to be pro-Trump conservatives. So I didn't know how that would go over. But you know, the people that we wrote about, I mean, I think they know just how much I love Yamhill, how much I care about the community, and it wasn't as if an outsider was airing the dirty laundry. This was somebody from within. I think that helped. I think also that at the end of the day, the people we wrote about, they didn't want your sympathy. What they wanted was your respect. And we tried very, very hard, even when describing some really dumb things that people had done, to convey that these were complicated, you know, people who were wonderful friends, and I think they, you know, they felt respected, and so it went over really well, and that was a great relief.
All right, appreciate your answer. I was really struck by the amount of candor that was on display from those who interviewed. And I'm sure that your being from within had everything to do with that. I wonder if you could talk about the personal responsibility narrative that is addressed throughout the book. What is it? How is it applied to these people, these former classmates of yours? And do you think it is a fair thing to do?
So, I mean, one of the paradoxes, I think, is that it's a narrative that is very much absorbed by this community. And I think that some of the problems come when they when they fall short, and in ways that undermine their self-esteem, that lead them to self-medicate further. And so you mentioned the Knapp family. They were the kids who got on the bus right after me each morning, and there were 5 of them. Farland was the oldest. He was my grade. His brother Zealand, his brother Nathan, his brother Keelan, their sister Regina. Farland was very smart, very talented. He dropped out of high school, so he never took chemistry, but he turned out to be a pretty good chemist, and he was the first person to make meth in the Yamhill area. And I just think if that talent, if he had stayed in school, if the school was happy to see the Knapps drop out because they were sort of troublemakers. If the school had fought for the Knapps, if Farland been able to graduate, then he could have done so much good. And you as Oregonians, you spent so much money imprisoning the Knapps. If you had spent that money educating the Knapps, sending social workers when their mom was getting brutalized by their dad in ways that traumatized the kids, providing job training, vocational job training, drug treatment, I think it would have made a big difference. Farland self-medicated. He died of liver failure as a result. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. and Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. At the time the book came out, Keelan was alive because he had spent 13 years in the state penitentiary, and he was going to do a book event with us, and he was really excited about that because he wanted to tell the family story. He didn't want us telling it, and he was, he was proud that the family story was told in some form. And then in March, because after COVID, he lost his job, and at the end of March, he died of a heroin overdose. So all 5 kids gone. Their mom's still alive at age 81. And look, they all screwed up, and they would acknowledge that. They shouldn't have. Farland shouldn't have cooked meth. They shouldn't have abused drugs, alcohol, but they were on a trajectory to make dumb choices from the time they were small kids. We failed them before they failed us. And, I think that, I think of driving. We know that in car crashes, people get into accidents because they do dumb things. They text while they drive too fast, they drink and they drive, or they get into arguments with somebody in their back seat. They get distracted. But we try to mitigate the consequences of dumb driver decisions. We have seatbelts and airbags and divided highways and lit roads, and we do everything we can to save the lives of people who show irresponsibility. And in contrast, for the Naps and the Greens and so many kids around here, it's the equivalent of putting spikes in dashboards so that people will really learn a lesson to teach them not to be irresponsible. And one of the reasons we focus so much on this narrative of irresponsibility is that as a country, the US, we have the toolboxes to solve these problems, not solve the problems, but to hugely mitigate the problems. Other countries have. We have the resources, but what we don't have is the political will. And I think it's because we spend too much time finger pointing at people and telling them, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't have done that. You made bad choices. You were irresponsible.
Okay. You've done a great job of looking at maybe some of the causes of why your former neighbors wound up in the circumstances they did. I wonder if we could turn now maybe a little more to solutions. You talk about education perhaps being the most important escalator for families to rise out of poverty. So maybe we could talk about that as well as other escalators, such as, say, drug treatment, job training. And is it your sense that these escalators are effectively broken?
Yeah, I think that the most crucial period may be early childhood. And that's, in Yamhill and in a lot of places, by the time kids begin school, they're pretty profoundly messed up. And other countries have more in the way of home visitation programs that support parents who are struggling to raise kids. And, that when beginning in there's a program called Nurse Family Partnership, and it works with at-risk pregnant women, and it's counseling them, while you're pregnant, try to avoid alcohol, try to avoid drugs. After the birth, okay, here's how we can deal with lead in your house. Here are some books you can read to your child. If you can't read yourself, then here, point to the pictures and tell a story, but talk to your child. Things that seem intuitive to middle-class households, but in a lot of households aren't. And so kind of the early childhood component, I think, makes just a huge difference. And then beyond that, K through 12 education as well, including vocational skills. I think that in the Democratic primaries, for example, there was a lot of talk about improving college access, and absolutely, we definitely need to do a better job on the college access front. But 1 in 7 kids in the US still doesn't graduate from high school, and those kids are cooked. if you haven't graduated from high school, if you're not functionally literate, as so many kids aren't, then how are you going to compete for the next 5 decades in the labor force? You can't. And that's the context in which people then self-medicate. We can, it's so much better to invest in the front end than to pay for prisons at the back end. I see it's getting darker. I'm going to move inside, I think. Does that make sense?
Sure, if you want to do that. I'm going to try to limit myself to just a couple more questions before I turn it over to everyone else. I anticipate they'll probably raise some things I was going to anyway. But you give considerable attention to the research showing that two-parent households in general offer greater stability and better outcomes than to children raised in single-parent homes. You also talk about the concept of the success sequence as it relates to being able to rise out of poverty. So could you talk about those two things, two-parent versus single-parent, what the implications are, and the success sequence?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that conservatives kind of basically got right was the diagnosis of family structure, family breakdown. And there's just increasingly been really good evidence that, especially for boys, two-parent households matter. Having a dad at home matters on average for outcomes. And I think that progressives were often reluctant to talk about family structure, partly because initially it seemed like an indictment of African Americans, and because it seemed to be blaming the victims. And the evidence has accumulated. It's also become now, this is a white issue. It's moved to affect all demographics. And I think the evidence is such that one has to accept the diagnosis, has a lot to it. I think the conservatives were wrong in their prescriptions for how to deal with this problem. They tended to talk about marriage promotion, for example. And under the Bush administration, marriage promotion was examined, and it just did not work. In contrast, the two policies that really seem to improve outcomes and lead to more children being raised in two-parent households. And by the way, it's it doesn't have to be a traditional two-parent households. Outcomes are actually slightly better for children in same-sex households than for more traditional households, apparently because no same-sex household has a child by mistake. But what the two things that did work for leading to more married couples having children in the context of a married household were, one, helping young men get jobs. So programs like career academies that provide vocational training for at-risk young men so that they learn how to be a plumber or an electrician or whatever and have a decent job, then they are more likely to have the resources to marry and raise kids in that household. And the other is family planning for at-risk teenage girls. And if a 16 or 17-year-old girl doesn't get pregnant and have a baby, then she's more likely at 22 or 24 to get married and have kids in that context. And so that's kind of our argument there. And the success sequence says that, and I'm going to forget the numbers, but if you graduate from high school, get a full-time job, and have kids after getting married, then essentially the poverty rate is negligible. Almost nobody ends up in poverty. Well, if you do none of those three things, then you're overwhelmingly likely to end up in poverty. And so conservatives sometimes use that as an argument that, it's all about choices people make. They don't decide not to finish high school and so on, but it's transmitted by, it's a function of who your parents are, the household that you grow up in. And if your parents didn't graduate from high school or don't value education, then you probably won't either. And that's where a good high school and good counselors and teachers who care deeply about kids and a good school district can really make a lot of difference. But in general, in America, we send privileged kids to first-rate schools, and we send disadvantaged kids to third-rate schools. And that's a function of local school funding, which is one of the original sins of American opportunity.
All right, terrific, Nick. I already see some excellent questions popping up in the chat, but let me see if I can just ask one more because it allows me to reference the presidential debate. Is it wishful thinking to imagine or envision that our politicians can find common ground on some of the issues and recommendations that you and Sheryl put out there? Because I'm thinking of the hyper partisanship that colors everything in our politics. And I'm also recalling that the issues that you raise in this book didn't even get addressed during the first presidential debate. Who knows whether they'll be touched on it if we have a second or third one.
You know, I'm gonna, I have a little MiFi that is my internet. And when I moved inside, I think I moved it too far from the window. So I'm just gonna put it over at the window. I'm gonna be right back.
Okay.
Okay. So George, I have a ray of hope on that front. And it's twofold. It's partly, I think there's a misperception that the white working class is kind of inevitably conservative. And in truth, the white working class and the black working class alike are socially conservative, but economically tend to be liberal. And so the black working class has gone to the polls and voted Democratic because issues of racial justice trump issues of abortion or same-sex marriage, whatever it may be. In contrast, the white working class has gone to the polls and mostly voted for conservatives because issues of guns or same-sex marriage or abortion, conservative judges, they trump those issues, those economic issues. But at the end of the day, the folks here in Yamhill, if you ask them about minimum wage, absolutely they want to raise it. A wealth tax on billionaires, absolutely. Broader healthcare coverage, universal pre-K, absolutely. On the economic issues, then they tend to be much more liberal. And that you see that in polls. Bandwidth for all, absolutely. And I sometimes wonder if this election may not be a little bit parallel to the 1932 presidential election when Roosevelt was elected, and with the mandate, he flipped the Senate, which had been Republican, I think, since 1918. He flipped it, and that enabled him to pass the New Deal programs. And that 1932 mandate was possible only because Herbert Hoover had screwed up the Great Depression so badly. And it seems to me that likewise, President Trump is perceived by much of the electorate as having screwed up so badly and the existing systems having failed so deeply. The fact that we don't have universal health care, that we don't have universal paid sick leave, these are holes in the safety net that other countries don't have, whose flaws are perhaps more evident now than they were before. So seems to me possible that this election will give Biden a mandate, perhaps a Democratic Senate as well as a Democratic House. And that while Biden is absolutely not a revolutionary, neither was Roosevelt. And I would hope that, he is indeed advocating pre-K for all, for example, coupled with kind of a child care program, a path toward universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a fighting chance that we may actually see some real movement on issues where the U.S. has been an outlier for decades. I'm not sure of that, but it's, you know, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I have a ray of hope that that may happen.
Okay.
Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm pessimistic.
There are a lot of people in this room that are probably hoping the same as you. Okay, so let's move to questions from the floor. I think I see this one from Rebecca. Is this yours? In Oregon, the rural areas have been hard hit both by fires and COVID, but those are the areas where you tend to see the Trump signs. So do you have perspective on that phenomenon?
Yeah, so I don't have my chat function open, so I'm not seeing the exact question. But in terms of why, you know, why people so clearly seem to vote against their interest, which, you know, so I guess one point I'd make is about faith, and that, you know, one of the people we write about was Mary Mayer, my 7th grade crush, and you know, she's smart, she's hardworking, and ended up struggling. She spent 7 years homeless, and she knew better than anybody the way the system has failed people like her. And I asked her, so did you ever think that politics might actually provide, you know, policy solutions to address these problems? And she said traditionally she never had, she never voted. And then in 2016, for the first time, she thought, oh, maybe there are, you know, maybe politics can help. And so she voted for the first time in her life for Donald Trump. And, you know, I think part of that was because he talked about bringing jobs back, promising these things that sure sound appealing when you're desperate. He created scapegoats that are also pretty appealing when your community's really suffering. And also, Mary got off the streets because of the help of a local church. She is cares deeply about religion, is very, very pro-life, and conservative judges was an issue that she cared deeply about. And so, you know, I think that, and I sort of understand that to some degree. I mean, in 1996, I supported Bill Clinton over Bob Dole, even though I thought Bob Dole was perhaps a finer human being, because Bill Clinton, I thought, would implement the kind of policies that I supported. I would say that I think a lot of the folks in Yamhill who voted for Trump last time, I think a lot will again vote for him. And partly that's because if you're in that orbit and you're getting their Facebook feeds, then, you know, the new, I mean, those Facebook feeds are pretty incredible sometimes. You know, I read my friends' feeds and I just want to go, you know, slug somebody in the mainstream media. And, but the economy is in desperate shape. And, you know, there are 10.7 million fewer people with jobs than there were in February. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks around here are struggling again. The kind of problems we talked about in Tightrope of social isolation, they're bigger now than ever. And I think it's pretty clear that Trump does not have the answers. I think to some degree, there is some defensiveness on the part of folks, and they feel condescended to and looked down on by the rest of the country. And I think that as a result, that fortifies their sense that they are part of the Trump team, and other people think they're deplorable. And you know, I think that's really unfortunate. But the economy is in such wretched shape, and I think Joe Biden does not seem threatening to a lot of these folks. So I think that while most of the Trump voters from 2016 will continue to vote for Trump this time, I think there will be a considerable number of defections as well.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I see two questions that are both related to economy and jobs. And I want to call on each of these people to see whether they'd like to ask the question directly. One of those is Shannon, talking about the disparity of wealth, followed by Walt Perry, talking about an increase in minimum wage. Shannon, if you are here, would you like to go ahead and ask Nick your question?
Sure. I think my question is just how do you combat increasing disparity of wealth and at the same time increase equitable opportunity across, both economic and racial bounds? Thanks.
Yeah. So I frankly think that for a lot of the folks who were of my vintage in places like Yamhill, it's kind of too late. That these are in many cases people who've been struggling with addictions for decades, who don't have a high school diploma. They don't have a driver's license because it was taken away because they didn't pay child support. And so I really think the focus should be on kids, and that's where we can provide opportunity, and that's how we address inequality. I don't want to give up on adults, but it just particularly breaks my heart when I see, kids today on the equivalent of the number 6 bus who aren't getting an education, who were raised in traumatized households, who aren't getting the support they need, and who are still dropping out of school. And so, on the policy end, I'd like to see much more early childhood education. I'd like to see raise minimum wage. I'd like to see more emphasis on jobs. I think that one mistake that my camp, the progressive camp, kind of made was in seeing jobs as an income stream rather than as a source of identity, of dignity, of purpose, of meaning. It's one of the things we looked at in Tightrope was that in 2008 and 2009 in the recession, when auto workers lost their jobs in both Detroit and just across the border in Canada, in Windsor, Ontario, the US policy response was extended unemployment benefits. So, we wanted to make sure that people had that income stream. On the Canadian side, in Ontario, their focus was job retraining. And so they went to these unemployed auto workers and said, okay, you've been a welder for 20 years, but we don't anticipate needing a lot more welders in Ontario in the future, but we will need more healthcare workers. And we can put you and these other auto workers in a class beginning Monday to become a nurse or an ultrasound operator or whatever it may be. And then every Wednesday you'll intern at the local hospital. And of course, on the Canadian side, they also didn't lose health insurance when they lost their jobs. And the result today is that on the Canadian side, those auto workers who lost their jobs, they're less likely to have ended up abusing drugs, their families breaking up, their kids in trouble. And one of the lessons to me was that jobs, it's way more than just a income stream. It's really a source. It's a marker of who we are, and I think we can do a much better job on that front.
Thanks. Great question, Shannon. Appreciate the answer, Nick. Walt Perry, you have a question about the minimum wage?
Around the first of the year, there was at least one study that indicated that an increase in minimum wage had a direct relationship of a decrease to suicide. Do you know if that was ever further explored, and do you think that's the case?
I remember reading about it, but I don't know of more studies on that. I do think it makes intuitive sense that suicide is at a 75-year high right now, and in many ways it's a function of all these issues of the fraying of the social fabric, of social isolation, of people losing their jobs, and just struggling here and there, which I saw in so many of my friends. And there's been concern that minimum wages, if you raise them, then you reduce the number of jobs. Companies will mechanize instead. I'd say that the evidence has been growing that is not the case, at least up to, at some point, surely, if you made it a $50 minimum wage, and clearly that would discourage employment, but up to at least $12.50, maybe 15, you don't lose jobs. I was also quite affected by some reporting I did in Denmark, looking at McDonald's franchises there. And McDonald's in Denmark pays $22 an hour to workers there, plus a defined benefits pension plan. I forget, 4 weeks paid vacation a year, a year parental leave, et cetera, et cetera. And I sort of wondered how it is that McDonald's that the business model works to pay $22 an hour plus all these benefits. And it was what I found was kind of sobering. And essentially it was that people who work at McDonald's, if it's not an after-school job all over the world, they tend to be at maybe the 20th percentile of the labor force in terms of skills. And in Denmark, somebody who's at the 20th percentile of the labor force is a high school graduate who is literate, is numerate, does not have a dependency issue, arrives at work reliably, and actually, generates considerable productivity for McDonald's there. In the US, somebody who's at the 20th percentile of the labor force, after 50 years of underinvesting in American kids, that person is not a high school graduate, is not very literate or very numerate, is not a very reliable employee. And so correcting that isn't just a function of raising the minimum wage to $22. It's about, investing in young people. It's about providing drug treatment programs, literacy programs, and so much more. And that's so absolutely we need to raise the minimum wage, but I think above all, we need to invest in young people, at-risk young people.
All right, thanks again, Nick, and thanks for the question. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Regina here to see if she might navigate these next couple of questions. I see that we're starting to run low on time, but I know we've got time for a couple more.
Yeah, thanks, George. This is such a fascinating conversation. We have a lot of interest in the chat around the politics and the policy of the conditions that you cover in the book. But I do want to take it back just for a moment to questions about your journalistic method. And I was struck by someone's comment in the chat that the people from McMinnville and Yamhill in the book are really presented, featured as human beings, as individuals. They're given a screen photo or they're introduced in person. And it got me thinking about your comments at the beginning of our conversation, that you were a bit nervous about the way that the community of Yamhill would respond to your book. And it struck me that this is an ethical dilemma that we hear a lot from journalists that are trying to do deeper listening to communities and deeper community engagement to drive their journalism, that there's really a tension between really listening to the voices of the community and lifting up those voices. And yet at the same time, you're a journalist at the end of the day. You can't pull punches. You have to tell the story the way you see it. And so I'm wondering, you said that you were really gratified because it seems that people in the community felt respected, as you put it. And I'm wondering, do you think that was because of your process or the end product or both?
I think that I think listening to people is just a great starting point. I've often wondered why it is that in this community, there tends to be a lot of hostility toward the progressive politicians who I think actually, have care the most about them. And I think it's a sense that those politicians are full of answers and full of policies, but don't do a lot of listening. And Bobby Kennedy, I think, was kind of a model for a politician who was obviously from an enormously privileged background, but went on these listening tours to very, very poor parts of the country and just, talked and listened and asked questions and kind of won people over in that way. So I think that helped a great deal. I think that I think it also just helped that so much that I was from the community, and one of the ethical problems that I was concerned about for a while was Clayton Green, who we wrote about. Clayton had cooked meth, and he didn't want me to write about that in Tightrope. And I kind of felt, how could I tell Clayton's story and leave out something, so central, I think, to what he had done for so many years. And also, to the fact that he had screwed up a lot of other lives by cooking and selling that meth. And yet he was embarrassed by it. And, we talked about it just very bluntly. And I said that, Clayton, I am going to be, fair to you. I care deeply about you. You're my friend. But I just feel this is a part of who you are, and that readers should see you in that full rounded way. And he trusted me, and he said, okay. But I think that if I hadn't, been a friend all these decades, I don't think he would have said that. And then there would have been this really difficult decision about how can I, how can you not report on something like that? How can you not share with the reader that fact? And I guess another sort of related issue I struggled with is Clayton, toward the end of his life, he was 400 pounds. He had a big beard. He looked like your image, like every image of a kind of a hillbilly, a country hick. And I worried that we have several pictures of Clayton in the book. And I worried that we were going to play into people's stereotypes and prejudices when we were really just trying to fight those prejudices. And, in fact, again, my sense is that did not happen, but I think that may be because the audience for a book like this is partly self-selecting, people who are maybe inclined to be a little less judgmental, a little bit more compassionate. I don't know if this is assigned reading in a college class, if there will be plenty of people who will look at Clayton and say, what do you expect? You sold drugs, you used drugs, I don't know but trying to figure out how I tell the stories of people I deeply care about, and I care about their reactions too. That was a challenge. It's a lot harder to write about your old buddies than it is to go in a refugee camp somewhere in South Sudan and tell those stories.
Right, and yet you have a window onto the nuance and complexity that you might not have a window on otherwise.
Absolutely.
We have kind of a related question about your process journalistically. Michelle was asking, as a writer, how do you pick a topic that will still be relevant in the civil discourse by the time the book is eventually published? Because that could, that obviously is going to take a couple of years from the time that you first get the idea. So, how did you think that through as you approach this book?
Well, I guess I thought I was pessimistic enough to think that American disadvantage was unfortunately going to be an enduring issue. And likewise, the other books that we've written, empowering women worldwide and, in half the sky, that the gender inequity is so profound an issue in so many places that it's going to it's going to last. And so I've never really tried to be kind of timely and hit a moment. And sometimes we've kind of benefited from timing. Other times we've been hurt by timing. But Sheryl and I have really tried to kind of write our books about broader issues that we think are enduring challenges.
Right. And if you might answer really quickly, Michelle is also asking, do you and Sheryl, who, by the way, I have to mention is, if I understand correctly, the first Asian American woman to win a Pulitzer,
Yep.
how do you work together to decide on book topics? Do you take turns or?
No, it's, they're the kind of issues that we both care about are, all of our books have been done together. Our first book was when we were in China, when we were leaving China, it seemed natural to do a book together. Then we spent 5 years in Japan, and we wanted to do a book about Asia more generally, so we did that together. Then Half the Sky about women around the world, kind of the same thing. We had, we cared about these issues together. Sheryl tends to have more of an interest in business and economics. I tend to have, more interest in social policy, government policy. So to some extent, we those balance each other out. I think also, like in the case of Half the Sky, that it would have been really kind of weird to have just a man write a book about empowering women worldwide. But if it was written just by a woman, that it would have been immediately marginalized as a woman's book. And so it kind of helped to have a man and a woman address this together. And I think it gave it a little more kind of heft and seriousness. In this case, I had a natural window into one microcosm of the struggles of the working class in America, while Sheryl helped broaden that to the challenges across the country.
Right. Thank you. I see that we're at 7:30, and I want to be respectful of your time. We have so many good questions in the chat, but I think we're at time. George, I'll defer to you.
Well, Nick, if you would find one more question from an audience member.
Okay.
That'd be all right.
Sure.
Carol Morton, you've got a very nice one. We've been talking about a lot of the solutions at the national level, but you asked a very good one. Do you want to ask it directly of Nick?
Oh, thanks for, I wanted to know, thanks for very much. This is just an amazing conversation. I wanted to ask what part of the solutions are at the state level, if any?
I think it's a great question. And I think actually that given the paralysis, at least until now, given the paralysis at the federal level, then state and local solutions have been necessary. Maybe that will change next January, if the Senate, if Biden is elected and also brings in a Democratic Senate. But issues like early childhood, the Congress has been just unable to address, while a bunch of states, including red states, have made some really pretty good progress on that. The moves away from mass incarceration have in many ways likewise been led by red states, including Texas. And I think that there is something to the idea of, that a federal country can experiment at the state and local level. And that's really kind of a benefit of the system. It doesn't work for some issues like homelessness, that it's really hard for one state or one city to try a new model for homelessness, because then it attracts people who are homeless from other states that don't tackle it. But for other issues like early childhood, drug treatment programs, vocational education, You know, maybe bandwidth for all. This, I mean, we've been pretty lucky in that I hope I haven't frozen a lot for you, but places like Yamhill were transformed by rural electrification, and in the 1930s through 50s, and you know that vastly improved productivity in households around here. The modern equivalent would be bandwidth for all, and I think we need to do that. And you know, I guess maybe that's the note I would leave you on, that I think for conservative Oregonians, and certainly for people around Yamhill, there's a lot of pride in pioneer roots, and a sense that our pioneer ancestors, you know, they relied on rugged individualism, and it was all about barn raisings and looking after themselves, and not on, you know, government programs, and that they did it all themselves. And I always push back at my friends when I hear that, and I say, you know, why do you think those pioneers ever came out to Oregon in the first place? It was because of a government program for the disadvantaged. It was, you know, the fact that the Homestead Act, well, originally the Oregon Territory version, and then later the Homestead Acts, and then it was, you know, the areas like this were enormously benefited from other programs for the disadvantaged, like rural electrification, like the GI Bill of Rights, which was just sent so many people to college, helped people buy their first homes. But those were really clever programs that help nurture opportunity, create opportunity, support people. I mean, look, these were, you know, it was white people, obviously, given Oregon's history. But I think that the tradition of rugged individualism and creativity works perfectly well with government programs that reward that initiative and provide incentives and help build opportunity. And that it's not just those individuals who benefit, but a state and a society as a whole. And thank you all for joining this conversation.
Nick, thank you. I'm delighted at the quality of the conversation. Believe me, we could go on another hour based on what we're seeing in the chat. But I want to thank you, and I want to turn it over to Regina for final words of wrap.
I'll just quickly say again, thank you so much. I know you can't see the chat right now, Nick, but there's so much gratitude and interest that you've spurred, and deeper questions that you've helped us think about. So I hope that that's as gratifying for you as it is for us. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight.